I want to go back to the early 1980s. I'm showing my age here. The early 1980s, before there were desktops and laptops and smartphones in our homes. I don't know if you remember then the phrase, people talked about the coming information superhighway. Those were the buzzwords. And I think the thinking was it would be I think highway is an American word. Really, it means a motorway of information into our very homes. And frankly, most of us then could not conceive of what that would look like. And significantly, back in the 1980s, we had no idea how much all of this information would become a mixed blessing. So much information. How do we know what is true? How do we know what is written with an agenda? How do we know what is mistaken, misleading, plain bonkers, although it sounds plausible? How do we sift through conflicting opinions? And crucially, how do we combat the problem that if we read something on the internet that we don't like, well, what do? We keep Googling until we find a page that says something we do like. With some sheepishness, I admit this, I was probably pre-COVID, so probably a couple of years ago now, I was just feeling ill. Very ill, and Sarah was away for a few days, so I did the NHS 111 app thing. I went through all the questions, I pressed enter, and up on the screen in bright letters, call 999. So what did I do? Well, I said, well, that's clearly wrong, and I made myself a cup of coffee. Now, I got away with it that day. No, actually, I didn't get it away with that day because I made the mistake of letting slip to Sarah what had happened, and she was somewhat less impressed with me. But it does highlight the problem we have, doesn't it? We crave information, but we don't wholly trust anyone or anything to give us the right information, and we don't believe the information we receive when it doesn't suit us. Now, why does any of this matter? Because we are people who want to make right decisions. We want to have our fears allayed. Even this last week, as I think I can count up a number of occasions, but even this last week, how often have you said, or how often have you heard said, I just don't know what to do about? So on a Sunday morning, we're working our way through Mark's Gospel. Mark tells us the very opening few words of his Gospel that he has good news for us. He has shout it forth from the rooftop news. He has the best news we have ever heard concerning a man named Jesus. Just before today's passage, Jesus has started to call people to be his disciples. And then, verse 21, they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Capernaum is a small town or a large village next to the huge lake of Galilee in the far north of Israel. Had Jesus taken an Uber cab from Nazareth, it was maybe an hour away. Jesus was Jewish. Jews did not go to church on a Sunday, but went to the synagogue on a Saturday. I've read somewhere that every village of a certain size had a synagogue. In fact, any place that had 10 families or more, there needed to be a synagogue. But not every synagogue had a rabbi or sort of Jewish vicar. And so it would be quite normal for non-rabbis, non-trained Bible teachers to read and explain what we would call the Old Testament. Mark chooses his words carefully. Mark does not waffle. In his gospel, he uses words like teach, teacher, teaching 99 times. He uses the word authority, especially in the early chapters, 10 times. You can see my first heading, finally, someone who teaches with authority. Listeners in the synagogue came away not impressed by Jesus' ability to speak eloquently or engagingly or humorously or without notes or who didn't speak for too long. No, they were impressed because he taught with authority. Does that merely mean that he knew what he was talking about, that he had mastered his subject? Well, vital as that is, maybe rare as that is, it's hardly amazing, it's hardly astonishing. No, Mark explains verse 22, the people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. The teachers of the law, diligent people, not idiots, diligent people who tried to explain what the Old Testament said, what others thought it said, what it meant for day-to-day living. How is Jesus so different from them? How was Jesus so noticeably different from even a trained, qualified rabbi? Well, Mark uses the word authority, and here I am indebted to Tim Keller in his book. Have you noticed that the word authority comes from the word author? I hadn't. When I was aged, I think it must have been about 9 or 10, that sort of age, Roald Dahl visited our school. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach. What did we experience that day in our school hall? The author read us the story he had authored. And we were amazed. We were mesmerized. We were captivated. Mark chapter 1, good news, the best news ever, says Mark. Jesus, the Son of God, God the Son, God himself, the author of the Old Testament, no more than that, the author of the universe, the author of history, the author of your history, has come into the world and he is teaching. He is speaking with an authority that you will hear from no one else. Finally, someone who teaches with authority. What did Jesus speak about that particular Saturday morning in Capernaum? Well, we presume he would have been saying some of the things that he will be saying in the rest of Mark's Gospel, saying some of the things that he says in the rest of his Bible. Who he is, why he came, what it means to follow him. Many of us have discovered that the more we look at his Bible, the more we discover to our amazement, there's that word again, that Jesus tells us everything we need to know in order to address every situation we find ourselves in. Every issue that troubles us, every area of life where we can expect to find joy and contentment, every area of life it is wise to avoid, how to enjoy a growing relationship with him, how to cope when things go wrong, how to react when others are vile to us, how to act when we have been vile to others, how to approach death as it approaches. How can he speak with such authority on all of these matters? Because he is the author of the story of the universe. He is the author of your story. Finally, someone who speaks with authority. But even in these few verses, there is more, because Mark tells us secondly, he says, finally, someone who acts with authority. We maybe know people who can say good, knowledgeable things, but can they actually help me? I go to the doctor, she tells me what the problem is. That is so helpful. But can she do anything about it? I find myself in a legal dispute. I find a good solicitor who tells me what the law says, but can they help me through it? A man in Jesus' congregation possessed by demons, and yes, I know we don't quite get this. Well-being is the in phrase at the moment, our physical health and well-being. Well, that's been on the agenda for years. Our mental well-being, yes, increasingly we are now talking about that. And our spiritual well-being. People do talk about that, but usually they're talking about how we relate to our inner spirit, whereas our true spiritual well-being, the Bible tells us, is all to do with how we relate to the God who made us. And it seems that just as external factors can affect our physical well-being, if you come along and hit me with a big iron bar, that will affect my physical well-being. If someone abuses me verbally, that will affect my mental well-being. The Bible tells us that the universe, God's cosmic universe, is far more complex than we can comprehend or imagine. There is such a thing as evil. There is a heavenly sphere where God currently lives. There are created beings in heaven, both good and evil. Sometimes we are tempted to do wrong, and we feel as though there is something, someone outside of us tempting us. Sometimes when things go wrong again and again and again and again, we feel as though there is someone, something behind it. And sometimes, Sarah will tell you this, sometimes people or regimes do something so appalling, we are forced to put them into the evil category. This man in the synagogue has an acute spiritual condition. Some modern writers want to say this is mental illness, but that doesn't fit the facts. Because here we have a man controlled by something outside of him that has got inside of him. Something that has an acute spiritual awareness of who Jesus is. Something who clearly understands that Jesus is a real threat to all things evil. And Jesus, with a word, deals with it. He releases the man. He frees the man. Verse 25, "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly, "come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were also amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority." He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him. News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. Mark is beginning to show us that Jesus not only teaches with authority in the world that he has authored, he also acts with authority in the world he has authored. Even in the most chaotic and frightening and extreme situations, he brings order and calm and amazement. Finally, someone who teaches with authority. Finally, someone who acts with authority. This is a game changer for us, isn't it? In a world where we do not know who to believe, where to go in order to make sense of who I am and why I'm here and how I am to cope with difficult situations, the difficulties of life, the uncertainties of life, someone has come who not only teaches the truth generally, but is willing to teach me the truth personally. Someone who not only acts for the good of the world generally, but for my good personally. And if Jesus was able to address the man in his congregation's acute problem, he's surely able to address my problems, isn't he? How can we help each other with our deep struggles in life? Well, let me tell you what I do and what I don't do. Someone says, Sean, come round for a cup of tea, and they tell me of something they are struggling with. Let me tell you how I never, ever respond when someone tells me of the deep struggles they're having. I never, ever respond, well, have you tried searching the internet? But very often indeed, I will ask, what do you think God's perspective is on this? And interestingly, very often the other person will then say, well, what do you think they'll say next? I say, what do you think God's perspective is on this? Very often indeed, the person will then say, I don't know. Because when you're perplexed, when you're in a dark place, when you don't feel you know anything, so what do I sometimes then say? Well, I sometimes say something like, well, I actually think you have more godly wisdom than you know. You've been listening to the Bible read and explained Sunday in, Sunday out. Maybe you've been reading your Bible at home week in, day out. You know more than you think. Given all that you know about God, if he was sitting here, what would he say? And then we get talking. And maybe I share a verse or a psalm that comes to my mind, and maybe they do too. But here's the thing, even then we may sit there together perplexed. And the words that come out of my mouth lots are, I don't know. I don't know. But God knows. And so let's speak to him. Can I pray? Can we pray? Can we help each other by having those sorts of conversations? Given the fact that finally someone has come who teaches with authority. Finally someone has come who acts with authority. On our own, but I think of much more value with someone else drinking coffee, we seek to discover what he has said concerning the place I find myself at the moment. And we ask him to act. Finally, someone has come who teaches with authority. Finally, someone has come who acts with authority. With one another, we seek to discover what he has said, what he is saying, and we ask him to act.